Welcome to another teaching video from Freedom Amarillo. We're encouraged that you're in search of the truth and trust that you'll find these teaching videos helpful to you. If you have any questions, please contact us by using the contact tab on our homepage. Today we're going to deal with part 2 of the birth of the Messiah. If you've not seen part 1, I'd encourage you to go back and look at it, because we'll be making some references back to it. The birth of the Messiah. This time of year, everyone is questioning and thinking about the birth of the Messiah. We found some interesting biblical evidence that I hope will encourage you as we worship our Messiah and as we honor him at the time of his birth. As we look at the birth of the Messiah, we realize that many different ideas have surfaced of when he was born. And as we look at the traditional scenes of the birth of the Messiah in the manger and wonder maybe how this worked, we began in the first part of the first video in talking about the logic of it and looking at some scriptural evidence. So let me give you a very quick reminder. We talked about the logic, and we realized that the birth was not in winter, evidently by the scripture reference that we have, and that the shepherds were in the field at night, which they would not have done during the winter, and they would have not been in the fields or the agricultural fields when the harvest was there, but after harvest. So evidently right following harvest is when the shepherds would go into the fields. We also realized that Joseph and Mary were traveling, as well as all the other folks, to pay their taxes, and we realized that the government would not have required people in the midst of winter to go and make travel on the road. So the logic doesn't hold too true to that. So the birth of John the Baptist helps us with some actual dates as we looked at that. The scriptures tell us that 6 months before Yeshua was born, that John the Baptist was born. We find that Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was a priest in the division of Abijah. We find that recorded in 1 Chronicles 24. And so we look at the dates about the priestly terms of service in the tabernacle or the temple, and we find that Zechariah served in the temple on the 10th work. He was in the 8th division, but because of the traveling feast with all the priests there, he served in the temple on the 10th week of the year. So Elizabeth probably became pregnant during the middle to the last of the 4th month. So if that's true, then Mary became pregnant during the 9th month. We have the 6 months that are there, or the part of the 10th month, which would mean that Yeshua would have been born in the 7th month during the Feast of Tabernacles, I would suspect. Now, as we begin in today's study about this birth and what might have happened, let's refer back to our Isaiah 46 principle that says that God teaches us the end from the beginning. So if we look at the beginning, we'll find some clues that'll teach us about what God's going to do in the end and in between, which would involve the birth of the Messiah. So let's go to Genesis 1. And in verse 14, it says, "Then God said, 'Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for festivals and for days and for years.'" Now, we've looked at this in previous videos, and King James translates it as signs for seasons, which is an acceptable translation. Festivals I prefer. And it just is telling us that the stars and the moon and the sun are all there to give us a timetable and to help us with special days and with years. And I believe the birth of the Messiah was one of those special dates. So let's explore a little bit as we think about that. This is a picture of the constellation Virgo, and we're going to refer to that from some scriptural evidence. Here's another depiction of it that a star's chart would show you of what it looks like. And then here's even another. So let's look at some biblical evidence about the constellation Virgo. In Psalm 19 it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky proclaims the work of his hands. Day after day they pour out speech. Night after night they communicate knowledge." Now it says that the stars are silent, but that they're pouring out speech and they're pouring out knowledge. So we need to study and figure out what they're trying to say us. Now the next verse, verse 3 says, "There is no speech, there are no words, their voice is not heard, their message has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun." Now, in the King James, it says he's pitched or set a tabernacle for the sun. Very interesting, the symbolism and the comparisons that we have here. But we're describing the heavenly stars and constellations. The next verse says, "It is like a groom coming from the bridal chamber. It rejoices like an athlete running its course." As we begin to look at this, we see there are a lot of references to the constellation, to the stars, and how they reflect and teach us and give us signs from God. In Job chapter 38 it says, "Can you fasten the chains of the Pleiades or loosen the belt of Orion?" And those of you that are familiar with the constellations recognize Pleiades and Orion. Here's a picture of the Pleiades. It's a brilliantly grouping of 6 or 7 visible stars located in the shoulder of the constellation Taurus. And beautiful picture there. Here's another picture. This is of Orion. It's a nebula. And the constellation bearing the name of a giant Greek hunter who, according to the myth, was bound and placed in the heavens. There's a lot of stories that go about this, but that's what Job was referring to. Back to Job 38, it says, "Can you bring out the constellations in their season and lead the bear and her cubs?" Next verse says, "Do you not know the laws of heaven? Can you impose its authority on earth? Can you command the clouds so that the flood of water covers you?" Well, we are seeing some importance and some input given to us from the Scripture about the constellations and what we might be able to gain from the knowledge that we know about them. In Psalm 147, it says, "He counts the number of the stars. He gives names to all of them." So even the ones that we don't have names for, God knows them all and has numbered them all. And so there's an important teaching here about the stars and what's happening. In Revelation, where we'll get into more of our story today, Revelation 12, John writes, and he says, "A great sign appeared in heaven." You would think it would be one that just really stood out. It says it's a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Here's an artist's conception of what John's talking about. The woman, the 12 stars on her head, the moon at her feet. And you'd say, well, now how did that appear in the stars? Well, we're going to take a little look at that and see if we can figure out what John is trying to tell us. Back to Revelation 12, it says, "She was pregnant and cried out in labor and agony as she was about to give birth." Verse 3 says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven. There was a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. His tail swept across a third of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she did give birth, he might devour her child." Now this is John in the Revelation that's speaking, and he's referring to the Messiah, and he's talking about this woman representing Mary who's going to give birth. And he's giving us a timeline when these 12 stars are there and the moon's under her feet. And then he talks about Satan as he appears there. So let's go back to Revelation 12 and see if we can figure out a little bit more. It says, verse 5, But she gave birth to a son, a male who is going to shepherd all nations with an iron scepter. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, evidently, it appears to us that John is writing about the Messiah who is going to come, and he's going to shepherd his nation with an iron scepter. We find that in several other places in the Scripture, so we feel confident that John is writing about, and I believe giving clues to the time of the birth of the Messiah. Now let's look at some charts and see. Here's a graph, chart, the great circle here of the constellations. And you'll see the lines that pass through the center there. That's the ecliptic. And that's the great circle of the celestial sphere that is the apparent path of the sun among the stars as seen from the sun. The plane of the Earth's orbit extended to meet the celestial sphere. So that's where the sun is going to pass across. Now I've highlighted right there on the left the constellation that we're looking at of the Virgin of Virgo. And you'll see that the sun passes right through her. So as the rotation changes, the sun is going to pass at different levels through that constellation. So we're going to take a look at that. Now here's another chart, and you'll see that Virgo's way over on the extreme right about nearly 4 o'clock. And you'll see the path of the orbit of the Earth and the sun, how all that works, and we'll try to put that together and give some time frames about that. Now, I'd like to just share with you about what the Encyclopedia of Astrology says about this constellation Virgo that we've just looked at. It says, the birth of the Messiah is associated with the constellation Virgo. It is the only sign of a woman which exits along the ecliptic, which is the track of the sun in its journey through the stars. She occupies in body form a space of about 50 degrees along the ecliptic. The head of the woman actually bridges some 10 degrees into the previous sign of Leo, and her feet overlap about 10 degrees into the following sign of Libra, the scales. In the period of Jesus' birth, the sun entered in its annual course through the heavens into the head position of the woman about August 13th and exited from her feet about October 2nd. But the Apostle John saw the scene when the sun was clothing, or we could say adorning, the woman. This surely indicates that the position of the sun in the vision was located somewhere mid-bodied to the woman, between the neck and the knees. The sun could hardly be said to clothe her if it were situated in her face or near her feet. The only time in the year that the sun could be in a position to clothe the celestial woman called Virgo, that is, to be mid-bodied to her in the region where a pregnant woman carries a child, is when the sun is located between the 150 and 170 degrees along the ecliptic. This clothing of the woman by the sun occurs for a 20-day period each year, and it moves a little bit. This 20-degree spread could indicate the general time when Jesus was born. In 3 BC, the sun would have entered this celestial region about August 27th and exited from it about September 15th. If John in the book of Revelation is associating the birth of Jesus with the period when the sun was mid-bodied to the woman called Virgo, and there's no doubt that that's what he's talking about, then Jesus would have had to have been born within that 20-day period. From the point of view of the Magi, who were astrologers, this would have been the only logical sign under which the Jewish Messiah might have been born, especially if he were to be born of a virgin. Now, as we look at the birth of Jesus, we have looked at several different accounts, one being the logic, and another being that of the birth of John the Baptist and the timeline that we see recorded in the Scripture of Zechariah serving in the temple. And the logic that the Messiah was not born in the winter plays in. and the astrological evidence now on this video today of what John recorded in the book of Revelation. All of these seem to point to the same time of year, the fall, the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, not December 25th, not middle of winter or in the winter, but earlier, right after the harvest, right in the beginning of the fall period. So as we refer to our 2 Chronicles or 2 Corinthians 12 passage 13 it says every fact must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So we've looked at 3 and maybe 4 witnesses and even others to determine that Yeshua, Jesus, our Messiah, was probably born in the fall around the Feast of Tabernacles. I personally believe that he was born on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles and circumcised on the 8th day. And that's the reason that God set up from the very beginning that there would be an 8-day festival, and the beginning and the last, the first and the 8th day, would be special days of honor. And I think as we celebrate these festivals, and we celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles, and include in that the birth and circumcision of our Messiah, we are honoring to God. And I believe that the Scripture lays out that this is the probability of when our Messiah was born. Thank you for participating with us today. We encourage you to watch more of our videos and give us input. Thank you for being with us. Shalom.